The easy thing to do when Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad were left out for England's tour of the West Indies was to get upset. Or better yet, make jokes. But there is more than going on here than just England ballsing up another big moment. Of course, it is the ECB ballsing up another big moment, which seems to be a quite consistent theme from them. I mean, quite clearly, it looked like a last-minute decision between a bunch of interim employees who then released a comment like a couple of hours later. It was not entirely smooth. So it's easy to write this off as just another ECB blunder. And I mean, at this point, they have the best average and strike rate with those in modern cricket. And that's quite a big effort in modern cricket. And in PR terms, that's certainly what happened here.
This is the last knock. My dad told me to say this.
But it's worth looking at the cricket side of this as well, because Andrew Strauss said there were 3 reasons why they did this. He said the test team hadn't been performing well enough for the last 12 to 18 months, and that the batting unit had misfired consistently. Strauss is obviously right on this. Since August 2020, England has won 5 of its last 15 tests. But we knew they were an up and down team before that. Going back 4 years, they really only beat the teams that they're better than, and then they lose to the ones that they aren't. And they're not that good, so there's a lot that they lose to and a lot that they win. There's no mad science to it though. Since the start of 2019, they've played 38 tests and they've won 14. They are not a very good test team. Strauss also went on to say if they wanted to be the best team in the world, they would need to win away from home more often. This I'm not sure about. It's not really a home and away thing for me. If you think of recent times at home, they lost to New Zealand, India, well, at least they're on their way to losing to India, and they drew 2-2 with Australia in a series that they were mostly behind in. Again, when they play the better teams, they struggle because they're not that good. If they want to be the best team in the world, they need to win everywhere against very good opponents. A lot more, home and away. And Strauss also said that this is the start of a new cycle, and it's an opportunity for us to get some new faces in the team. Actually, the new cycle started at the end of the World Test Championship. We're now kind of mid-cycle. The Ashes no longer define periods of time in English cricket, or at least they shouldn't. England should now be planning to beat everyone, and yet in England they're still not talking about cricket that way. Like, for instance, former England player and Middlesex head honcho Angus Fraser said the quiet bit out loud again recently. And so many people in English cricket don't care that much about anything that doesn't involve beating Australia. The thing is that winning at home and away is an important part of beating Australia. Like, imagine a situation where you set up your team so it could win home and away test matches all the time, and then you worried about individual challenges. It's a novel thought, and it doesn't really seem to be how England think about cricket. So now let's talk about the Broad and Anderson part of all this. It angered Martin Samuel so much that he stopped ranting about football to rant about cricket. Outside of cricket season. That's actually some effort. And the gist of his piece is that England has a lot of bigger problems than Broad and Anderson. And that's unquestionably true. They can't bat, which is very true. Joe Root aside, it's kind of all-rounders with mediocre records and failed openers that seem to be interchangeable. But remember, they've already dropped all their batters before and all their wicket keepers before as well. So many times. You can't drop your way to success. The underlying problem is far deeper than selection. And England have, of course, let their coach and director of cricket go. So if it's far deeper than selection, then you actually need to change the people who make the decisions. But of course, England's already done that. You can argue that Silverwood wasn't a good coach, but they weren't that good before him. And I'm not sure how you're supposed to coach when your 2 opening batters both average 31 in first-class cricket. Ashley Giles probably had more to do with this just because of the kind of job that he had. But England's batting and spin didn't drop off a cliff because Ashley Giles was in the job, right? They were free-falling when he got it. And yeah, it's his job to turn it around, and you could say that he didn't do that. But I think, again, they were already pretty much dead when he got the gig. And he's gone. England has already made that change. And of the bowling, spin is obviously a far bigger issue than the seamers. But England know that as well, right? There is a very good chance that for all their worry about Matt Parkinson and how slow he bowls, he's going to get a test in the West Indies because they've kind of tried everyone else at this point. And that's the thing, they've kind of tried most things at this point. I don't think we've seen an international team try as many new things in a short period of time as England have. And almost all of them have worked in white ball cricket, and almost all of them have not worked in red ball cricket. England cricket is trying a lot, and now they're trying something else. And realistically, what do they have left to do? Other than relieve Joe Root of captaincy and give it to a player who's already physically overworked and has had mental health injuries of very recent times, there's not much left to do, right? England has tried everything, and almost all of that has failed. So the real easy thing for English cricket right now would be to keep Broad and Anderson ticking along, while they can both physically continue to tick. Job done. And the thing is that there is no problem with Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad. But there is an issue with them when you combine them together and you make yourself a Broderson. Firstly, it's just how similar they both are to each other. In England, that is not a problem at all because they were genetically modified to bowl well in England. But having two medium-fast right-arm seam bowlers outside England is always more of a concern. And we've seen them in Asia and Australia and South Africa and the West Indies. Often look like there's just too many of them in the one side. And then when you leave them out, they will rumble, whether it be themselves or a few friends in the media that they've sent a WhatsApp to, right? They are both very good at letting the world know exactly how they feel about not being in the team. Which is fair, right? Because Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad have bowled a staggering amount of deliveries for their country. And they have an incredible amount of wickets because of that. And they rightfully feel like that means that they should play every test. That doesn't mean that they're right. And you can certainly see why England might sometimes think, actually, the best thing to do is to not play both of them in an away test. And I think that leads us to the second major reason, which is probably related to the fact that they are so similar. Neither Anderson or Broad take a lot of wickets away from home. We're not talking about averages here. They actually end up with quite decent averages. It's really about the sheer number of wickets they take or don't take. In the last 5 years away from home, Anderson and Broad average just under 6 wickets per game when travelling. Even when accounting for the fact that many of their attacks have 5 or even 6 bowling options, it's a small number of wickets. And if you look at them compared to all the bowlers with 50 wickets on the road in the last 5 years, only Shannon Gabriel is between them for wickets per match. And all the bowlers on this list are fantastic. Taking 50 touring wickets is an incredible effort in a 5-year period. But here's the fun bit. As I said before, the averages actually aren't that bad. Stuart Broad is under 30. On the road, you would certainly take a bowler who can average under 30. And Anderson is at 23.5. I mean, that's good. But they don't take wickets. They contain and they are respected. And when you have two major frontliners averaging 6 wickets a game, it means that your support cast needs to be amazing. And that's not currently the case. But it has been at times when they've had Broad and Anderson, right? Swan, Flintoff, Tremlett, Moeen, Brosnan, Finn, Wood, Leach, Sidebottom, Stokes. They're not all great bowlers. But in certain places they were. And for certain time periods they were. But none of them are as good as Broad and Anderson. Nor do they have their longevity either. But those are fantastic backup bowlers. And the thing is, this isn't just about the last 5 years, which is why I mentioned all those other bowlers as well. Broad and Anderson struggling to take wickets away from home is not new. If you look at all the England bowlers since the war, this team has had a lot of very good travelling bowlers. And many of them are out and out quicks, like the Freds, Truman and Tyson, the poet John Snow, dazzling Darren Gough. And there's a few spinners on this list as well. And you would expect that because those are the sorts of bowlers who should do better away from England. The problem is that there's also Angus Fraser and Matthew Hoggart, Andy Caddick, Ian Botham and Alec Bedser. They're all England-style seamers, right? And all of them take more wickets per match than Anderson and Broad, who are far more down the list here than you'd think, considering how incredible they have been. And of course, I'm looking wickets per match, so maybe they just got fewer innings to be able to bowl in. So I did wickets by innings as well. And they're still way too low. And if you're just a person who wants to look at average, that's fair enough. But they both have an average of over 30 when they travel. And that doesn't mean that Broad and Anderson only takes wickets at home, because they both have low averages in certain countries. Anderson averages under 25 in the UAE, England and the West Indies. 2 of those places don't really have clouds. Broad is good in South Africa and the UAE. He also averages 25 in England and 28 in New Zealand. But they aren't a consistent overseas threat. But they are both brilliant when they're at home. And that is obviously a very normal thing. That's where they grew up. That's how their game naturally evolved. It's the same for any bowlers around the world. But if you start looking at England bowlers who've taken 50 wickets at home and away, it is just clear that they are not as effective when they travel compared to other England bowlers. Bowlers like Flintoff and Gough didn't have the bodies that were ever going to allow them hugely long careers. But they did have bodies and bowling actions that actually set them up to be very good away from England wicket. That's not to say that they're better bowlers than Anderson and Broad. But the other thing here is that you have to understand how important all those home wickets are. That's when most people are watching, right? Home series are for casual fans and away series are for the hardcore people. And so taking the amount of wickets that these two have at home, it makes it harder to just even question them. And especially when they travel away and they still keep their averages reasonably low. But they just don't take that many wickets per match. And all these numbers that we've talked to, and being that this is all about the Ashes, because that's where England just were, and that's the thing that when you lose, you generally change everything. It's worth looking at the Australian numbers as well. In fact, Broad is slightly better in Australia, but he still only takes 3.2 wickets per match there. meaning that for England to win the Ashes recently, if you account for Broad and Anderson being a roughly 6 wickets, it means that the rest of your bowling attack is going to have to take 14. So on that tour, they would have needed a combination of Leach, Robinson, Wood and Stokes to actually combine for around those 14 wickets. Now, there was no situation where Jack Leach was ever going to take more than 2 wickets a test in Australia. And honestly, Stokes the same. You don't even want him to average more than 2 wickets a test. So that means that Robinson and Wood would have had to combine for 8 wickets every match, which means that they would have had to essentially outperform England's greatest wicket-taking pair. Oh, and of course there's no team where you would have been able to fit that bowling attack I just mentioned in. It's too many bowlers. So one of Robinson, Leach or Wood would have been left out in any situation there anyway. Do you see what I'm saying? The maths just doesn't work out. And it's not that they had to take 20 wickets in every test. But of course, to win test matches in Australia, they were going to have to do it at least 3 times probably to win that series. Again, the maths just doesn't work out. And while we're talking about Robinson, it's worth mentioning how similar he is to Broad and Anderson. In fact, he's probably more like a combination of both of them in some ways. But he's obviously more like Broad because of the height. Of course, the other problem with Robinson is that we know that he's not that fit. He's certainly not as fit as these far too older teammates. In fact, he looks spent after 1 day at the Gabba. Mark Wood is obviously a fantastic bowler and something very different, which is very handy for the England team. But he is a fast bowler and he obviously would need to be rested more than Broad. If you look at his injury history, you would have to say he'd have to be rested more than almost anyone. And the problem is that because he is a better striker, especially away from home than those 2 guys, you probably want him to bowl more, which then limits how much he can be rested in a game and also within the series, right? Now, some of all of this would be fixed if Joshua Archer was fit. But we don't know if Jofra Archer's ever going to be able to bowl series after series in Test cricket. And we also don't know if he keeps having injuries like this, if he's even going to risk it. Tamal Mills decided not to. And looking at his injury history, even with the reduced schedule, you'd say that Mills was probably right not to play Test cricket. So the ideal situation for England, really, when they tour anywhere outside of Asia, is for 2 of Archer and Wood, and maybe someone like Ollie Stone to be fit. And then for 2 of Broad, Anderson and Robinson to be fit. But that lineup doesn't really allow for any spin either. And you would have to say that outside of England, you'd be better off to have bowlers who are slightly quicker than slightly more skillful. So in an ideal world, more often than not, England are going to have to pick between Anderson, Broad and Robinson for 1 spot. So it's not really ideal, is maybe the best way of putting it. Oh, and we haven't even mentioned the all-rounders yet, like Sam Curran or Chris Wokes. And they need to be mentioned for 2 reasons. One, Wokes was supposed to be the replacement for Anderson, except that Anderson never left. And they both need to be in squads because almost every other bowler I have mentioned so far cannot bat. And you can add Craig Overton to that list if you want as well, even though his batting is nowhere near good enough. But England still seem to think it's good enough to bat at number 8, which kind of tells you the problem. This is all a giant mess. One that Jofra Archer could make slightly better. There are very few situations in life that Jofra Archer can't just make better. But even if they get Archer back, if Stokes can't continue to bowl as often as he once did, that causes huge problems. And I'm pretty sure Stokes is already not as fast as he once was. And I think injuries have slowed him down just a little bit. And he may never be that fully quick again. When Stokes was really quick, having Broad and Anderson together was less of a problem because you already had 1 quick bowler in your lineup. That's why Stokes is so important. If they don't have that, well, I don't know what they have. So the real ideal bowling attack for England would be Anderson in odd tests and Broad in even ones, Jofra in most, and Robinson or Wood by conditions, an unknown spinner, and then Stokes fulfilling whatever role was required. But that lineup has no number 8. So who does Wokes come in for there? Broad or Robertson? Curran is exactly the same. Overton could cover Robertson, but clearly isn't anywhere near that level of bowler. And Overton averages 21 in first class cricket and 18 in these 2 tests. He's a handy number 9, but hardly strengthening anything at number 8. I think you're understanding it's already really messy, and we haven't really factored in injuries or loss of form or any of those sorts of things. If England move on from Anderson, they're getting rid of their greatest ever wicket taker, who has won series at home and away, who has taken 173 wickets in the last 5 years at an average of 21.41. That's a hair worse than Pat Cummins. So obviously you keep Anderson. Braun has 169 wickets at 26 in that time, by the way. These are hard players to just move on from. But the England team is losing. And it's not Broad and Anderson's fault that they're losing. The entire team around them just isn't that good. Batting, bowling, and fielding just isn't up to scratch at the moment. Anderson over the last 5 years has been as good as he's ever been. Broad's been amazing over the last 5 years as well. Now, part of this has been helped by the pace-playing pandemic, but they're still been really good, especially in terms of average. But again, just not in terms of wickets when they travel. but they're also not getting the support they need. If Jofra Archer was fit and available with them over the last couple of years, I think their records would be slightly better because they'd be bowling to more unset batters. They'd also have Archer occasionally bouncing everyone and scaring everyone. And it's not just Archer. Woakes not being a good overseas bowler has always hurt them. Robertson's fitness of recent times seems like it's going to be a problem. Overton and Curran's limitations. These things all play a part in why Anderson and Broad haven't been as good away from home. Because they need an incredible support cast to be able to do that. And so England's thought is, well, if we're going to make this support cast better, they need to play more overseas. And the way to do that is to ensure that Anderson and Broad are not in the team. And of course that's tricky because the minute you do that, the press, former players and fans rightfully go, why are we dropping two great players because a bunch of other players are not that good? And the truth is that Broad and Anderson are not the problem. They are just a very small part of it. And as I said before, England has already dropped everyone else, including coaches and general managers and selectors. Everyone's gone. So they are left with the option of dropping a nuclear bomb on their strongest foot and resting Anderson and Broad for the West Indies. But here's the fun bit, because we need to talk about this particular tour. Because this is either the absolute best or worst place to drop Anderson and Broad. The problem with the West Indies tour is that if England bowlers do well, we won't know if this is real or not. Since the beginning of the pace playing pandemic, this is the worst place to bat against seam bowling in the world. Seam wickets are costing barely 21 runs. Even if England lost this series against the West Indies coming up, the bowlers would still have great records because all bowlers who go to the West Indies at the moment come back with great records. Oh, and it gets even more fun from an England point of view because they'll be using the Duke's ball in the West Indies. You know, the ball that they use in England. The ball that is so different to the SG and the Kookaburra that England bowlers can't really learn that much from using it all the time. That's the ball they're going to be using. They're going to be getting seam-friendly wickets and the Duke's ball in the West Indies against a poor West Indies batting lineup. So depending on how you look at this, it is either the best place to move on from your stars or the worst place to move on from your stars. This new crop of bowlers will get confidence, but they also probably won't learn that much. They already know how to bowl on seam-friendly tracks with the Duke's ball. That's why they're in the England team to begin with. So it won't really mean that their backups are ready to take over or even support Broad and Anderson anymore. They may not have developed at all. They've just taken a lot of wickets in the West Indies. From an England point of view, it means that they can't really cancel Anderson and Broad, and it also won't mean that they're a better team than they were beforehand. And like most of the problems in English cricket at the moment, this doesn't have a neat fix, right? Keeping Anderson and Broad together doesn't work because England already isn't a great side. Turfing them when their replacements aren't any better is obviously not going to help either. I mean, Chris Woakes has spent an entire career not taking wickets overseas. It is weird, and I don't really understand why it's happened, but he's 33, and his average of 52 away from home obviously has some misfortune attached to it. But chances are he's suddenly not going to start taking wickets at an average of 25 when he travels anyway now. Like, he's not going to get that much better. And the same with Ollie Robertson. He isn't about to get a lot fitter because he bowled some long spells in the Caribbean, although I suppose it can't hurt. But he's not about to become a Neil Wagner long spell machine either. In fact, having two bowling geniuses around probably is a huge help for him. And you would have to say that Overton and Robertson probably won't play that much together because they are so similar. So if Robertson plays, they're not going to see that much more of Overton, I wouldn't. And the other thing is that all those players I've mentioned so far have bowled overseas before. They're not new to bowling overseas in Test cricket. So of the bowlers who really haven't bowled much overseas, that would include Saqib Mahmood, who just needs more first-class games. He just hasn't played much first-class cricket at all. And that's not something that Broad and Anderson are keeping him away from. In fact, he's one of the few bowlers who actually probably matches quite well with Broad and Anderson. And the other seam bowler on that trip is Matthew Fisher, who I don't really think will play anyway. You see what I'm saying? I've used the word ideal a lot. It's an unfair word because there is no ideal. Of course, there is a strategic angle to what has happened with Broad and Anderson, as a lot of people think that what Strauss has done is essentially made it a lot easier for the next coach or the next director of cricket to move on from Broad and Anderson. Think about it a bit like when a politician leaks something ahead of time, almost to soften the blow. And I get that, I really do. England should take a lot of wickets this series regardless. And it's possible that a lot of fans and maybe even the media will get very excited as this new crop of bowlers takes a lot of wickets, even if England lose to the West Indies, which is generally what they do when they travel to the West Indies. But there is nothing easy from all this, because the mass of Broad and Anderson involves more than 1,000 Test wickets. But it also means 6.2 wickets when they take a flight. It's a mass problem, and it won't be salvaged by a hasty 5-minute conversation or an interim committee. The easy thing to do when Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad was left out for England was to get upset. Almost everything else involved with this is incredibly hard.